Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. After the summit between Presidents Trump and Xi in South Korea, there was a collective sense of relief worldwide. At least the US and China agreed not to further escalate a trade war that has disrupted the global economy over the last few months. But how is China's economy faring? Has the trade war's impact been felt on the ground? We explore macroeconomic trends in episode 22 with London-based Calvin Lam. Today, we turn to Olivia Plotnick, a social media and marketing entrepreneur based in China, who recently completed a marketing research project spanning 30 cities in 60 days. These were not the major cities typically discussed, but Tier 3 and 4 cities. They're smaller regional hubs with expanding economies and large dynamic consumer populations. Olivia's findings of health and fitness, tourism, beauty, and youth trends challenge our conventional wisdom and offer surprising insights into the state of China's economy and its consumers across age groups. Let's hear Olivia's perspective. Welcome, Olivia. I've been looking forward to taping this episode for months because I've been following your journey, traveling to 30 cities in 60 days in China. Well, first of all, tell us who you are and what brings you to this crazy journey. What were you trying to get out of it?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So I've been living in China for about 10 years. And the first time I came to China was back in 2007 for a trip, a summer program during high school. And then I came back to China in 2012. I studied at university in Beijing. And then in 2015, I moved back to Shanghai area and have been living in China ever since, working in marketing. So I've always been on the agency side. About 6 years ago, I started my own agency focusing on social media marketing. So we help foreign brands with their social media strategy and account management in China. Now, like I said, I've been in China for 10 years, which both feels like a long time and a short time. And this year, at the beginning of the year, I had read 2 books, actually. I read a book by Emily Fong, which is Let Only Red Flowers Bloom. And that book actually led me to read a book which inspired her writing by Philip Pan, which is Out of Mao's Shadow. And these are both journalists who spent many years in China, and their writing tells the story of where China is at that moment in time through the narratives of different people that they had met throughout the country and over the years. And I just thought that was such an interesting way to explain or look at where the country is now. And so, I work in marketing. I read so many reports all the time with data and big numbers. And I really thought hard about this different approach to understanding China through these
why do you feel like
stories.
it's important to have a different approach? I mean,
Yeah.
you said you read, numbers and big reports. Is there anything that makes you feel like maybe doesn't really quite reflect what's the reality in China?
It's often not the whole story, and I think that's what I began to realize throughout all of the travel that I did and going to all of these different cities and talking to people. There wasn't any point where I was like, wow, the data has this completely wrong. I think, in general, the data is correct. Like the general themes that we're seeing come out of China is correct, but the context behind that and the different stories that people tell just allow you to go and understand what's happening and why that's happening. So the data can tell you this is happening, but you don't really understand why it's happening until you're going out and talking to people. And especially, my business is helping brands connect to consumers in China. And a lot of that has to do with how they show up online. We can't help a brand if we don't understand what's happening offline, if we don't understand that deeper layer. There is so much going on right now that's not happening in the big cities. And we know a lot of growth is coming from rural areas. You have rural household incomes in lower tier cities that are rising in 2024 by about 6%. Compare that to urban incomes, which are rising about 4%. I thought, okay, in 2 months, in 60 days, how many cities could I reasonably go to.
And
Reasonably
how
may
did you
look
decide on it's on average like 2 days in a city, so you're on the go
exactly.
almost every day. I mean, you could have done it in a smaller number. Why 30? And how did you pick those cities? And these are not your, typical tier one
No,
cities.
no. Yeah, they so mostly tried to focus on tier two and below. This would give me a really good amount of touch points throughout the entire country. So I went to almost every single province as well. So it wasn't just concentrated in the north or the south. I covered almost the entire country. To your point about these are kind of cities less traveled. A lot of the third, fourth, and even fifth tier cities that I went to, sometimes I was just looking at the map and zooming in and out, looking at different cities and just choosing to go to a city based on kind of where it was and where the next point that I wanted to go to, and kind of looking up a little bit of background data on it to see, what their GDP growth was like, what their industries are, and what they're focusing on.
Have you been to most of them or you've not?
No, I had only been to maybe one or two. So I had been to Kunming back in 2007 and I hadn't been back since. So it was about 18 years difference between going there from the first time. So that was a really interesting experience. The city has changed so drastically. I remember being there in 2007 and looking out on so many lush, beautiful fields. And now it's quite a big, happening city, really big with tourism. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in Yunnan. But for the most part, I went to cities that I had never been to before.
What were your expectations of those lower tier cities compared to your actual experience there?
When I moved back to China in 2015, I was living in a third, fourth tier city outside of Shanghai. And so I kind of had a baseline, okay, 10 years ago, this is kind of my impression of what a fourth tier city looks like. I was focusing a lot on health and fitness and sports and what that looks like. Retail spaces. So what do the malls look like? Looking at EVs. And I was looking at it through those lenses. And in those lenses, it has just changed so dramatically. I filmed a lot of what I was seeing, and I got feedback from a lot of people from in the US who told me, looking at these quote unquote rural cities was making them feel like they were living in the US in a third world country because things were just so advanced and so technological.
A lot of people don't have the opportunity to visit, and not even me, right? I don't even know what a tier 3 or 4 city would look like now. How do you compare them to cities in the US or elsewhere that people are more familiar with?
So in China, a tier 3, tier 4 city still has about anywhere from 2 to 10 million people. In the US, that's obviously a huge city, right? But in China, it still feels smaller and more rural.
Is it just less densely populated?
It's less dense and there's less, there's fewer high rises. One aspect of it, if you've visited Shanghai in the past 2 years, you will notice very dramatically how many EVs are on the road, right?
Yeah.
It's like
Almost all of
90% of the, yeah, almost all of them. And one of the things that I initially started out tracking was, okay, I want to track in each city how does the EV adoption level feel? And I had kind of a metric system of ranking it between 1 to 5. Gave that up about 10 cities in because in every single city, third and
It's all
even
EVs,
down
right?
it's just all EVs. And so to me, I was like, there is not going to be any range or scale because it's just so ubiquitous across all of these cities that almost all the cars are EVs. And so that I think is so shockingly different to, a city that you would go to that kind of would be, the equivalent.
I thought it's interesting that you talk about the three perspectives on the economy. China's economy it's almost like a huge myth to the world. There's so much writing about it, but most people have not visited China. So share with us your three perspectives.
I can share a few different stories and conversations. There was one conversation I had with a Didi taxi driver in Guiyang, which is in Guizhou province, which is one of the poorer provinces in China. And we had a good conversation going, and so I felt comfortable enough asking him how he felt about the economy. And he was one of the first people who I talked to who said China has actually come a very long way. If you take a step back, right now is much better than 10 years ago. We have the high-speed rail. We have Didi, where I can also work several jobs and supplement my income through this ride-sharing application. And so his view was a very macro level view of like, we've come a long way and things are actually pretty good right now, even if not everything is working. And then I had spoken to another taxi driver who was really pessimistic about it and was really
Also in Guiyang or somewhere else.
sorry, not in Guiyang, in Yinchuan, up in Ningxia in the north. It's also a very poor province. He was very pessimistic about the economy, and I even asked him, do you have hope that things will get better? Like maybe this is just a bad time and things will get back on track. And he just didn't even want to answer that, and just, really shook his head like disparagingly almost. Again, coming back to the point of like, there's not one easy answer of, is China's economy doing great? Is there, should we be super optimistic about it or should we be really pessimistic about it? There are areas of high growth. Looking at the sports and fitness and kind of health and nutrition category, that is booming right now. The interest level from people is just growing at an exponential amount.
And that's national. That's more than just metropolitan, or I should say
Exactly.
tier one cities.
Yeah, that was maybe one of the more fascinating aspects of going and visiting all of these lower tier cities and just seeing how many people are participating in sports and an active lifestyle. And that's very different from what I experienced 10 years ago. It would be extremely rare to see anybody running, much less wearing running shoes or running gear. In all of the cities that I went to, I would go on runs or I would join run clubs or I'd go out in the parks in the morning. And from younger to older generation, everybody is out in the morning running, jogging, and that's not a new thing. Older generation in China are very good about getting out and moving, but compared to 10 years ago, they were out like in the park doing all their like
Yeah.
easy exercises, and
Traditional
like
Chinese thing, which is
exactly.
not considered exercise probably by
Yeah,
or
like
sports.
not doing sports, but now they are in their running kit going on a jog,
Even the older people,
even the older generation. I was in Datong in Shanxi province and I was going on
another
a
poor place.
yeah, and I was going on a run and I met this group of like 10 runners who were all in their 50s and 60s. They were really hardcore runners. They were out every morning running this loop in Datong. They do marathons regularly and they do them in different parts of the country and they go travel to these different cities all over China and they go with their friends and they spend a couple days there and they run the marathon and come back.
So you share two perspectives, right? You want to finish the third?
You have people who are of this one mind of like, okay, we things might be a little bit rocky right now, but we're on the right trajectory. Then you have people who maybe times are really tough and they're not able to see out of the weeds. Like it's not very hopeful for them. And then you have younger group who are trying to figure out what this new China means for them and how they fit into it. They're less concerned about outside forces and more of like, how do I create my own identity within this country?
So these are the three perspectives, basically,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I want to go back to the two taxi drivers. I wonder, they have such stark, different perspectives about the country's future. Why do you think that's the case?
The one who was more optimistic was younger. The one who was a little bit more pessimistic was older. Also, in Guiyang, we talked a lot about the high-speed rail. In Guiyang has experienced a lot of construction recently. Like they've had a lot of projects around infrastructure. And so that has really, I think, changed the whole connectivity of the region. So that could play an interesting role in that. The taxi driver who is more pessimistic, older generation, he had two younger kids and one of them was still living at home, had a job, but not the opportunities that I think were envisioned for his child that were kind of felt like it was promised.
Yeah, so it's probably personal experience in that way. One of the most interesting things that I observe from your travel is the Starbucks and Luckin. Tell us, all the Starbucks and Luckin and other coffee shops and milk tea shops that you visited. What are they like? And is Starbucks dying in China?
That's the big question, right?
Uh-huh.
So there's for years now, there's been the kind of headline Starbucks versus Luckin. And now we have Starbucks exploring a joint venture partnership or selling some of their shares to a Chinese company. And you have Luckin launching in the United States. So this kind of battle between them
I've been
has
to
really,
their two stores in New York.
really, okay, what did you think?
It's actually similar to their
Experience.
initial business model there. Very small storefront, and it's
Okay.
mostly for people to order out.
Yeah.
But I think that app ordering part of it is probably not what most Americans are used to. But all the discounts, coupons, and all that stuff, that's like completely Chinese, right? So I'm curious how they're doing, but it's significantly cheaper, I would say, from my ordering experience, and the coffee is obviously great. So, yeah.
You think the coffee is really good?
Yeah, I think the coffee is really good.
Interesting.
And it's
I
not
would
just me, it's my friends as well.
Wow. Okay, so I would say Luckin in China is known for their coffee not being good, for being lower quality in
Really?
China. The
Huh.
price is super low and the quality in general, the feedback is like, okay, it's not the best quality, but the price is super low. It's just like
I actually
it's the
think they're
coffee that's
better
going to get
than
you by.
Starbucks. I always felt like they're better than Starbucks. So I used to, as you know, I used to work for a VIP Kid. So the first floor of the office building was a
Yeah.
lock-in, which is also their business model.
Yeah.
So I would always get coffee from there because I have a distaste for bad coffee.
Yeah.
That's always my anxiety if I go to, when I was living in China, if I go to third tier or fourth city, I couldn't
Like,
get
oh, the
like
coffee's going to be so
the
bad.
coffee.
This is going to be super interesting for you then. So, okay, so we have the Starbucks and Luckin battle, and there's a lot written about that. What one interesting thing that I didn't really expect was Luckin in big cities like Shanghai, and as we've experienced in Beijing and in New York, it sounds like the storefront is very much just order in and go. And in these lower tier cities, I was really surprised to find a lot of the Luckin venues have seating and people just hanging out inside like a Starbucks, which is not super common, I think, in their locations in Shanghai. So I would go to as many Luckins and Starbucks that I could find. For the majority, it felt like a lot of the Starbucks were pretty empty and very dead. Not that, all the Luckins had crowds outside them. I do think a lot of orders still come in from, online, and there's delivery workers carrying those out. What was really interesting was the Starbucks locations that would be very busy and completely full would always be the Starbucks Reserve locations, which would be located usually in one of the mixed C malls. And so those would
What do
be
you
the
mean
ones,
reserved location?
you know how the Starbucks Reserve where it has like the Starbucks star, it's like a special different branded Starbucks location. Just the Starbucks Reserve locations. Like they have have you noticed they have the little star and it's like I guess a higher end kind of
Is that the China
Starbucks?
thing?
I assume that their more higher end stores, the reserve locations, are in the nicer, more premium malls. And so those would always be the ones that would be full of people. And it wouldn't just be people like I've seen a lot of articles written, people are only in the Starbucks bringing in other drinks and they're just hanging out in there and not buying. I didn't really notice that. I saw people, with Starbucks drinks and sitting there working and
Yeah.
eating and everything. So those seem to be the locations that were doing really well, whereas the other ones, that are just, the ends of the bookending the streets, didn't seem to be
Yeah.
doing really well.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting talking about coffee is that, and something that I didn't anticipate as much, was the amount of local coffee shops in all of these lower tier cities. And so I started to, because I wanted to have a similar methodology of visiting each city so I could kind of easily at the end be able to track everything. And so part of that methodology was visiting 1 to 3, sometimes I visited up to 8 different local coffee shops in each city, and these each would have a very specific theme. It was almost as if you were in Portland or Seattle, where you have all these cute little coffee shops that are very local and
Independent.
independent, and they had all, so I would talk to the owner or barista, whoever was there, and the majority of them have opened within the past 1 to 2 years, so they're
Wow.
all very new. And sometimes
Are
you would
they
go to
young people? as
Young
owners?
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Young people as owners. Sometimes they have moved back, from
Mhm.
Shanghai, Beijing, or Shenzhen to their hometown and started this coffee shop. And it's, set up with a very cute theme. And the drinks that they have, they'll mix different types of tea with the latte or create like a latte with pretzels and cream in it, of like just the craziest combinations of different types of lattes and coffee inspired drinks and some tea. But they were quite popular, a lot of them, and especially in cities that I went to Dalian up in the north, and there was just an entire street where it was one independent cafe after the other, and they all had a lot of people in them. When you look on social media apps like Xiaohongshu, you search for a city, it will come up with posts from people who are at coffee shops and posing for photos and taking pictures there. And it's kind of almost like driving this wave of domestic tourism in a completely different way to
Hmm.
travel and explore a city.
Interesting.
So this is almost driving a new wave of services businesses, which is
Yeah.
what the government wants. Healthy economies have a very high proportion of
Domestic
their
consumption. Yeah.
right from services businesses. So I thought that was a really interesting development. Certainly not something that you would have seen, I think, even just 5 years ago,
Hmm.
or 10 years ago for
Yeah.
sure.
And I also saw that you visited a lot of like milk tea or drink shops,
Yeah,
right? They're not necessarily coffee shops. And how are they
exactly.
different or similar?
The latest statistics that I found was from 2023 that said that there were over 500,000 registered milk tea brands in China. And at that time, the closest kind of comparison that I could find for coffee shops was around a little under 200,000. So there's just an insane amount of milk tea brands in China. And if you think there was one coffee shop after another, the milk tea brands is just on another level.
And owned by young people?
So the milk tea companies, which are larger, they're more
Are mostly
chains.
chains?
They're
Okay.
mostly
Yeah.
chains,
Yeah.
exactly. You have the big ones like Mi Shui, and you have Hey Tea, you have Molly Tea, you have more local ones coming out of Yunnan like Shangshang, you have Chaji, of course, which is also in the US. And it's just insane watching these because all of them will be busy. All of them will be fulfilling orders, that are taken through mini programs or mini applications. So you'll have to wait anywhere from 15 minutes to like an hour for your drink sometimes because it will be so busy. When I would go into these premium malls and look at what are the stores that people are going into, what are the most
Yeah.
popular ones, always be milk tea, EVs, and Pop Mart. And I think Pop
We'll
Mart
talk
and
about
milk,
Pop Mart later, but
yeah,
okay.
I think those have like, and especially for milk tea, it's like this kind of wave of emotional consumption, right? Like it's this little treat, a little pick me up that you can have. You can customize it. It's very convenient. It's very easy for you to order. There's this constant level of newness. So the milk tea brands, they will always have seasonal drinks coming out. They will have IP collaborations that they're doing, with like Lotso, like that, the pink bear, or they will do with celebrities. So there's
So
always like this new thing coming out.
I can't remember, was there that much milk tea places 10 years ago or no?
No, no.
Yeah.
This is a
It's like a
relatively
more
new,
recent.
yeah, relatively newer phenomenon. I think Haiti was kind of one of the first big ones on the scene, that I remember. And like this is back in 2019, 2018. It started becoming quite popular,
Yeah.
and then it's just exploded.
I'm not surprised, and this is very similar to Taiwan. Milk tea places just everywhere. And it's like a newer thing, and it's mostly young people who they want to be an entrepreneur, a relatively easy entrepreneur. They don't want to work for bigger companies anymore. And it's like endless supply of milk tea shops. And it costs very little to operate. I think, like you said, right? It's like a little thing. It's very cheap. It tastes good. If you feel like you can still afford something that makes
Exactly.
you happy, and it really doesn't cost much.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say depending on some of the delivery e-commerce platforms, if they're going through a price war at the time, it could be anywhere from like free to 35 RMB, like $2 to $6, or something
Yeah, that's
something
pretty
around this
cheap. Yeah.
range. And now you see a lot of them trying to go abroad as well, like
Oh, yeah,
Haiti.
they're already coming here. There's a lot more in American cities, and they all adopt sort of the Chinese model or Taiwanese model. You can personalize all your orders. I want to talk about Pop Mart. I feel like that's another very new phenomenon that most non-Chinese probably don't get.
Yeah. So, Pop Mart has become very globally famous because of Labubu, which, it was kind of like the summer of Labubu. Everyone was, you had
Is it still
celebrities.
as popular?
So I've read some articles recently about the resale value in secondhand markets is coming down. And so
Mm,
there's some speculation of like, okay, is this trend starting to cool off? I think it's moving into another phase. Obviously, a trend can never stay like wildfire at all times. So I think it's still quite big and quite popular, but it's slowing down a little bit. And, that's up to Pop Mart to see how can they continue riding that wave? How can they continue introducing new
yeah.
IPs or new formats? Pop Mart in China is quite interesting. I think it's similar to the milk tea. It's like this little dopamine hit. The blind boxes, that's not a necessarily
How
new
much does it
concept,
cost to buy one in China?
around like 10, $12. Obviously, depending on which one you buy, they can go up to much higher than that. Almost addictive because you have this blind box, you don't know which character you're going to get. So it's almost an instant, surprise and delight factor when you open it and see what it is. It's very social. So, you can share it's an experience of opening it.
Mhm.
So the whole concept around it just taps into all these different virality and
Yeah.
anticipation and scarcity. TikTok and Pop Mart and this idea of these small dopamine hits that we're getting and engineering that experience of the dopamine hit and how addictive it is to keep coming back to that, whether it's something digital or a physical product. And Pop Mart has done that incredibly well. I would visit all of these malls in all of these different cities, and the malls would have quite a bit of foot traffic. They would be really busy, but people
So the
weren't
malls
going
are
in.
still busy.
The malls are still busy. I wouldn't see them in Nike or Adidas or Solomon, or they wouldn't be in these retail stores. They would be concentrated in the Milk Tea and Pop Mart, some of the
Mm,
F&B locations. Pop Mart would just draw crowds of all ages.
there,
It's
basically.
still
Yeah.
still a huge fad. Yeah,
You also talk about EVs in those shopping malls.
yeah.
So if EVs are already everywhere, is it just that people still like basically not everyone has an EV, right? So there's still a lot of room to grow, or is it saturated? Like, what's the reality there?
There's still a lot of room to grow, and I think this summer was still on the tailwind of these subsidies that were being offered by the government for people to purchase EVs. So I think there will be a little bit cooling off once those kind of dry up and go away. You spoke about saturation. Obviously, there in terms of brands and competition in the market, it's huge. We have this, Neituan, the involution, where there's just
Ocean.
an insane amount of competition, which is driving the price down, which is great for consumers for the time being because you can purchase them at relatively lower prices. But for the brands, brands are going to go out of business. It's only a matter of
What are
time.
we talking about? Like how many brands, mainstream brands of EVs are we talking about in China now?
Oh my gosh, I'm not sure of the exact number. I want to say it was in the hundreds, but I could be wrong about
Yeah.
that.
So
But
they're still fighting out.
unfortunate as it is, and the government, how effective it is or not, are introducing measures, to pay suppliers, within a specific time period and trying to kind of see how they can curb this just insane amount of competition that is going on. In the malls specifically, it would be common to see anywhere from 10 to 14 different EV brands in the mall, like having stores within the mall, all on the first level. So you go
Yeah.
into the mall and it's just EV brand after EV brand. Tesla is still there. And it wasn't like nobody is in Tesla. The most popular ones that I noticed were Xiaomi and Huawei.
What about robotics? Did you see any?
I did see at the Huawei location, and it was very gimmicky. They had a robot dog outside their location in Chongqing, and it drew a huge crowd. So, it was kind of just to get people into
But
the
it's not
storefront.
everywhere yet,
It's not
right?
everywhere. Obviously, I stayed in a very large number of hotels. In all of the hotels, every single one of them, they do have the robot,
Yeah, the
the
service
service
robots.
robot. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So those are really ubiquitous. I don't necessarily think those are extremely high tech at
Yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
point,
No, they're not. Yeah. Yeah.
but you don't necessarily see that in many places in the US.
You kind of described that you focus on four specific trends, right? Health and fitness, tourism, beauty, and youth. Why did you decide to focus on these four trends?
They're trends that I have the most experience with working with brands previously in China, so I have a good idea of where that has started 10 years ago and where we are now. In health and fitness, that is one category that I feel is unequivocally booming
Yeah,
in
yeah.
China. Beauty is quite interesting because I think there's a lot of opportunity, but the competition is incredibly fierce and you see it slowing down a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's still a
The
very
competition
interesting
is it
space.
mostly domestic brands or domestic versus
I
international?
think you have the bigger brands are showing slower growth, and there's a lot more domestic brands coming
Yeah.
up. For youth trends, obviously very interesting because that's where's the future heading and how are brands going to be able to communicate and market and what are the trends around that. And then for tourism, looking at domestic tourism, because that's indicative as well of the kind of services economy and how well the economy is doing in general. I also started watching quite closely trends around seniors and we call it like the silver generation,
Yeah, yeah.
because I saw so many older generation out traveling. So kind of that fits into
Well, as a
tourism. And I
percentage, they just have more. I mean, they have fewer young people and more old people.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so that's going to be quite a big conversation in China.
What surprised you the most in terms of the consumer culture? You've written how the GDP numbers don't tell you all the stories.
The biggest overall change is deeper evaluation from consumers on what to purchase. People are willing to spend money on certain things still. It's not like I'm going to not spend money and just shut down. Like people were going out to shopping malls, they were going out, to pedestrian areas. So they were still willing to spend money. It's this a very different evaluation of how they spend that money and what they spend that money
And
on.
what do you think is the biggest change in terms of what did they spend before and what they're spending now?
Now it's more around how is this going to better make me healthier, or how is this going to make me a little bit happier? I would say more inward focus than before, rather than just going out and buying Nike because everyone is buying it, or buying these foreign brands because it's really popular. It's more of how are these Solomon shoes are going to bring me so much of a deeper value than going in and spending it on a purse.
I wonder, do you think it's because the Chinese people are going through this transition? They obviously made wealth quickly in the past 20, 30 years. So there was a period of time where I feel like showing off your wealth by buying those products is very important. Whereas now I see a lot of online stuff that's more about pursuing your spiritual calmness, trying to just be more at peace, more inward looking kind of thing.
Yeah. And I see that manifesting in different ways with different groups. So, for example, the older generation who were traveling, a lot of times they want to get out and have these new experiences and do these things while they can still walk and move easily and really enjoy and experience life in this different way. So for them, it's more of how do I enjoy myself? looking towards the younger generation is more an exploration of self and trying to figure out what I like and who I am and how do I express that and how do I kind of create this mold of individuality. One really interesting thing that I noticed was a lot of young people dressing up in cosplay. And, in Shanghai, that's quite a normal thing. There will be a lot of really big events in Shanghai, and so people will go to the event and you'll dress up. But this was more just people, young kids in their everyday life. So just going to the mall or going out to dinner, complete, head to toe, insane amount of makeup, really intricate costumes. They look like a 2D character. Or a virtual character.
Is it similar to Japan?
Very
That place,
similar.
Shinjuku. Yeah, it's similar to that. Is it like
It's
the
very, very
young,
similar.
yeah. Okay,
So it kind of
fascinating.
originated out of that. And it's more, and it won't be a group of them where they're all dressed like that. Two or three might be in costume and two or three are just dressed in plain clothes. They don't really care who is dressed like what. And I had a really interesting conversation with an 18-year-old in Xiangyang, and I had asked him about, what do you think about your peers who dress up in cosplay? Is that weird for you? He just gave a very straightforward answer of, it doesn't matter to me at all, really. That's an interesting thing for brands to have to think about, especially when it comes to luxury brands who have a big focus on, their products are aspirational because other people desire to have those products, or other people see people wearing that, and that brings the owner of that luxury product value because other people want it. Whereas if you have this new generation of younger Chinese growing up who don't really care what other people are wearing or the bag that they have, how do you still make that object have value? It can't be just a flashy thing that you have because other people want it. How does that brand serve you as an individual, and how does it help you explore your identity and tell your story?
Interesting. What would you say, just from the 60 days of traveling, that you have learned debunk the media coverage of current China?
I think Western media coverage still focuses heavily on China is experiencing economic downturn at an alarming rate, and that the economy is not doing really well, and that people are really struggling, and that the tariffs are really going to hurt China. Of course, as we've talked about, there is the reality. China's economy is growing at a slower pace than it was. That doesn't mean that the economy is doing, terribly by any means. So it doesn't match that narrative. I met quite a few entrepreneurs who still even want to build businesses to sell consumer products to the US despite everything that's happening with the tariffs. So I think there's a huge level of optimism that isn't discussed in a lot of the headlines, I think.
Is it concentrated in particular type of people, places, or
Not that I felt or noticed. It didn't feel like in the South it's way more optimistic, or in the North it's way more pessimistic. I think there was a general level of like, this is the reality that we are living in, and we're going to find a way forward. There was one city that I visited, Shantou, which is on the coastline, more in the south. In 2023, I think their GDP growth was around 5%, and then last year in 2024, their GDP growth was only about 0.2%, so it had very low growth. But
because
it's a
it's
city.
kind of an export-oriented city,
Exactly,
right?
it's on the
Yeah.
coast. There's a
Yeah.
port there. But it's a city that I visited that it felt much more vibrant and positive than I was expecting. There was a huge amount of foot traffic at the malls that I went to. People were dressed very nicely. A lot of young people out shopping at the malls. So that would kind of contradict if you're just looking at the numbers and the
The number,
maps as a
yeah.
brand, you might say like, okay, we should kind of avoid this area or this
How do you
region.
explain it?
I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah.
um, there's, an online trend right now talking about like the boom era, like nostalgia, where people are dressing up or when you act for the life that you want to have or the life that you think you had.
This is a very thorough research project that you had completed. For those who watch China's economy, whether it's macro, micro, as investors, what advice do you have for them in order to better understand China's economy?
You have to get on the ground. And it's really not just Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, or Shenzhen. Is also just so much that can come from visiting third and fourth tier cities. And it's easier than it has ever been to visit these cities. I did almost the entire trip by train. I took 25 trains and only 6 flights across the entire country. So there is no excuse not to go out and see these places.
For those who kind of know Chinese government, they're always very cautious about inequality or equal development between the coast areas and the inland. And even during the booming days, I feel like the government was still trying to make sure the wealth is distributed as equally as possible to the extent that they can engineer that. So do you feel like from your trip, did you see any place that you feel is poor?
If you're looking at it from a Western perspective, for sure, there were still places where it's like that house is very bare bones, and there's just a hole.
Okay, so you can still see those places.
Yeah, 100%. There is still poverty, and I think that's the other thing to be really careful as well of with the numbers and GDP per capita in particular, because you have a lot of these regions, especially that are getting a lot of money and investment for hosting, big data centers or cloud centers, whereas like the GDP per capita for certain businesses, might be doing super well, and you're still having people who are not doing well, but that's going to bring the average up a lot.
Fascinating. I hope you're going to produce lots of content out of this.
Yes. So we'll have a report coming out, which will talk about the different categories tracking and really what are the questions that brands should be asking.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. Based on Olivia's research, there are at least 3 perspectives on China's economy today. Chinese consumers are still spending, but their priorities have shifted. Experiences and personal well-being now outweigh luxury goods. The older generation is becoming more active and health conscious, while the younger generation is exploring self-identity and individualism. Economic growth continues to accelerate in lower-tier cities. Ultimately, data alone cannot capture the complexities of Chinese consumer behavior. And mainstream Western narratives often miss the underlying optimism within China's economy. This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next time.